I'm Paul Rogers. I'm an independent software developer. Been using Erlang for roughly 10 years on and off. I do contracts, so I do whatever work the client wants. I've done some Erlang, etc. I've got a master's in mathematics, so I've had a long time interest in cybersecurity, in particular cryptography. And I've got a master's in oceanography, so I've had a long-term interest in devices. We sent things into the ocean all the time. This talk I'm going to be doing, it's about security on these Nerves devices. And the scenario is the following. I've got 3 Nerves devices up here. I'm going to be talking to them one at a time. And I'm talking to them through this little Hutu router up here. That's just so that I can keep my network. It makes it easier than going through the a hotel's network or whatever we're using here. And I've got an iPad that I'm using, right? So the idea is this. It's along the lines that you sell this device to somebody, and it runs a stoplight, and you're really proud of that thing, so you charge somebody, and they pay you $2,000, and they buy this from you, think that's great. And then you write a little iPad app to run the stoplight. Okay? So I want to look at a situation where I want this iPad to run that stoplight, and only this iPad run that stoplight. That's sort of the scenario. So I've got a baby monitor. I've got an app that will unlock my car, etc. There's lots of situations where this would be the case. With that caveat, I will also mention that this could also be this guy talking to a cloud server. Nothing I'm doing here really requires that it be Nerves, but I think the IoT world and Nerves is really interesting, again, from my background in oceanography. Okay? So here's what I'm doing. I'm going to look at the first example. I'm going to run the stoplight from my iPad with the HTTP interface. System overview. The RP3 is running in Elixir Nerves. I'm not going to introduce Nerves. I'm not an expert on it, but it's a really cool project if you ever want to get a Pi or an Arduino and use it. It's great. It's using Elixir Ale to look at the stoplights and this momentary switch that I've got. And it's using an HTTP interface called Ellie that is actually made to be really fast on small JSON-style API, back and forth, etc. That was this person's whole thing. His reason he didn't want to use Web Machine or Cowboy or any of that is he made this thing screaming fast for a subset of what a real big web server might do. iPad, enough. Interaction. I'm going to place the Pi into pairing mode because I just bought it. I want to pair it with my iPad, so I download the iPad app. I'm going to pair it. Once I pair with it, I can log into it, and then I can control it via a simple JSON API. That, again, doesn't matter either. It could be GraphQL. It could be REST type interface. It doesn't matter. It's just messaging going between this guy and that guy. That's all that really matters here. This is the highlight, the way this the OTP looks on the Pi. I've got something listening to pin 17. If it goes hot, then I know that I can send this guy into pairing. I've got listening to 3 pins, 9, 10, and 11. Those are the red, white, and the red, yellow, and green pins. Then I've got listeners on my Ellie, and I've got a couple other ones in there. One's running the network. When I first turn this thing on, it goes and searches and finds where these guys are, just using something like ping. And then I've got a login manager that's going to handle sending the password back and forth. The stack on this, if you've used Plug, Ellie uses something that's very similar. All of them do, right? Sinatra, anybody uses the same idea. So that's a pretty small stack of the first thing that comes in, it looks at the status handler, and then it looks at the login handler, and finally it lets me run the lights. Okay, so I'm going to do this now. So the first thing I do is when I try to use this, oh my, the angry gods have gotten me. If they did, I do have this canned as well, and it looks like the angry gods are going to get me. I thought by setting this up beforehand I'd be all clever. I'm going to mimic what I did to do this. I apologize. Again, it could take me a number of minutes to do that. So what happens is when I put it into pairing mode and I send an HTTP packet, it's very, very simple to put a man-in-the-middle proxy. This is a particular, I'm using Charles here. It's a man-in-the-middle proxy that's capturing what comes in. We can see there that the first thing it did looked at the device status. The first time it did that, it said the thing was blocked. So I had to put it in. I can do this and I can get it into pairing mode. Then I put it into pairing mode. I paired with it, I logged in, and then I can run some things with it. The key here is, though, that if you look at the request and the response, it's just JSON flying across the wire. And obviously, that's no security. I mean, that's just a no security situation, and it's non-starter. Okay? The problem here is that I can easily run this thing by as soon as I have that API, I can fire something up like curl and just use that same API and run the stoplights. Okay? So this is really going to irritate me that I can't do my little demo there. But if I can run a command and actually change the stoplights by just looking at the API. Okay? So here are the problems with using HTTP in this way. I'm going to differentiate slightly, but both of these people are the think evilly people. Eve, I tend to think of as just being an eavesdropper. She can look the traffic. She can see the plain text password go by. She can see the plain text password go by. She can capture application data, right? Do both of those. And then Mallory is the one that actually does damage. Mallory's much more dangerous because she can alter traffic, and she can actually manipulate the API for fun and profit. There's a lot more to that. I hope to be able to, actually, since I'm not doing this, I should have time to talk a little more about some examples of that. But more importantly is that Mallory can control the stoplight. Is once she sees this API, she can get on this network. She can run these stoplights just as well as the iPad can. So, okay. So what do? We'd say, well, obviously we need to add encryption to this thing, right? So what does encryption actually mean in this world? It almost always means that what we do when we encrypt things, what we mean by when we say we add encryption to something, is we use symmetric key encryption. Okay? So that's great, but here's the big problem. How do we get the key on the iPad and the device? It's called the key distribution problem, and there is absolutely no perfect solution. There's only trade-offs. Okay? So the one that might first come to mind, and people do this, they use a pre-shared key. There's issues around using a pre-shared key. One is called forward secrecy. If you use a pre-shared key and I capture data for a month and finally break that key, I've got a month's worth of data that I can decrypt, right? Because you've used the same key, and now I've got it, right? Key refresh is what you would say, well, okay, I need to be able to change the key. Well, that becomes problematic because you're right back into the case. How do you get it on? How do you get the key there? If you pre-shared it, then you have to go out to the device and put a new key on. Again, non-starter. So there's several reasons why, even though people have used pre-shared keys, you shouldn't. So what we tend to do is instead say we'll use dynamic key establishment. Okay? We'll do that with the way we do that is use an asymmetric scheme to actually to get the key on the two devices, and then we use symmetric key to provide the actual security. So under this scenario, I run HTTPS again, and I see stuff like this. I did forget I have them canned over here. I don't know why, right? So this is an earlier example of where I captured this, right? And this is goodness, right? We think, oh great, now look at my communication. I'm done. I think I'm done. I go have a beer. I'm done for the evening. And then someone calls me, says, I hope you haven't had too many beers because we realized that we've got a problem. This is still HTTPS traffic, but now I'm back into the same land. What did I do? I just stuck a man in the middle between the two. Okay? The reason this worked in this particular example, the reason this worked is that this guy is actually, these iPads that I have here are jailbroken. So because they're jailbroken, I have what's called an SSL kill switch on them. And with that, I can stick a man, again, it's mine, but I can log in. Again, remember, I bought this. I can get my iPad, jailbreak it, use this app that you sold me, see the traffic, and be able to analyze it just like I could before. And now, okay, maybe I don't want to hack my own, but now I can go get my neighbors and say, yeah, it turns out they bought one just like mine. Let me see if I can change their lights. And you can't, right? Because you've got a peek into the API. Whoops, wrong way. So even though we thought we were done, we were having our beer over in excitement thinking, well, we had everything encrypted. It turned out that with the man in the middle, we actually didn't. And what's more damning here is that once I know that API, I can use curl again. The only thing I had to change here is I had to put the -K in front. The -K just says, trust any certificate. But again, it's me, so I'm doing this. I'm the evil hacker, right? So yeah, trust my certificate and go and play against some other machines or somebody else's lights. So the issue here is that the HTTP traffic can still be snooped. Now I took Eve out because we basically took care of the passive observer, the eavesdropper, but we still have Mallory. She can still snoop the traffic. Again, remember, this is through legitimate use. She's using my software that I wrote, talking to my server that I wrote, and using a jailbroken phone to look at the API. So she can manipulate that API for fun and profit. Now, is that true? Well, I've looked at some apps from clients. I've been able to, well, as an example, I went to a client and I took my iPad and I said, I've been looking at your app and I want to show you how it works when it talks to the phone you've got there, your own phone. So just log in on there and do it, right? They did, and then they handed it back to me. I said, great, now I know your password, right? Because I was actually rooting it through, and I was doing the exact same thing. So, and they were running a site, they were running an app that was actually using public key pinning. And this still works. I didn't care that it was public key pinning. It's the SSL kill switch overrides that. So he was a little disconcerted by that idea. Likewise, I can look at the entire API. I've done things where I'm white hat only. I do it ethically, but I create 2 accounts using some service, and I show that I can do something on one account and then make effect on the other account. Something like I had another client that had an app that never got off the ground, never made it to market, but it had something similar to a GitHub-like, right? And I could log in on one, and he could post something. I stole his post and then gave myself 1,000 stars on it, so that somebody would look at it. They would still see his post. I didn't delete it, but now his post and my post would be sitting there. One would have 1,000 likes. Who do you think they thought really owned it? Me, right? Again, it was all because I was able to look at the API and go in and start twiddling the API into ways that it creates what's called the attack surface. If I know your API, I can do things just at that API that you may not expect me to be able to do. Again, if I had these running, and I apologize for that, I can go into these and actually turn the red and green light on at the same time. And you can imagine if you're speeding toward a green light and toward a stoplight and it's red and green, what do you do? Right? It's obviously an inconsistent state. The other aspect on this is that man in the middle can just snoop the traffic. Now this one's a little odd because is this really a threat? Well, some people think it's more of a threat than others because I don't think that state actors are going to come after my app, but they can. right? There are people, there's a lot of money in this. That's what the NSA is about. That's certainly what China's got in groups, North Korea's got groups, etc. There are state actors that are just trying to look at man-in-the-middle traffic. In fact, corporations buy as software. They'll buy things that do this man-in-the-middle attack so they can be sure their employees aren't sending trade secrets out. So they're doing it to their employees on a routine basis. So this is not invisible. It's just hard to do. But that doesn't, you don't have to worry about me in my garage doing it, but you can imagine the NSA is a different question. So how do we get here? Now I'm going to veer for a moment and talk a little bit about the math behind this and what we're using and how it creates a situation that I think we need to change our thinking slightly. To do that, I want a little of this history and a little of this. So we start with Diffie-Hellman. This is what really started asymmetric cryptography in 1977. Diffie-Hellman, maybe 76. Diffie-Hellman published a paper, and they did this scheme. I'm going to show this with some small numbers because I think it's kind of nice to see that this is what's happening when I'm using TLS and HTTPS. It's what's happening, and it's kind of nice sometimes to see it with small numbers and actually go, oh, that's it. It's just we're using bigger numbers. Chuck and Sarah agreed to use this G, which is called a generator, and an N, which is, and I'm choosing 13. That tends to, you want that to be a prime number, and the G, you want to be what's called a generator of the group, of the order of that prime number, blah, blah, blah. Too much math, but you want to choose those values. Chuck then can pick a random A. He says, oh, I'll just pick 5. He takes G5, raises it to 2 to the 5th power, mods it by 13 and gets 6, and sends that to Sarah. Sarah does the same thing. She chooses a random number. She got 8. She takes 2 to the 8th, mod 13, and sends the 9 back to Chuck. And voila, they can now do a similar calculation and come up with the K equals 3. What'd this buy me? Well, this is the key distribution thing. Right? Imagine Chuck and Sarah were saying, what we really need is a shared secret key. Well, they just got one. Right? Well, I'll talk more about that in a moment. So Chuck and Sarah, what we call this they've established a key via key agreement. There's a problem with, here's what. This is Eve, or Mallory in this case. Even if Eve knows the G and the N and sees the 6 and the 9, it's very difficult for her to calculate that K. This is based on this is called the Diffie-Hellman problem, but it's actually based on discrete logarithms. And the idea is loosely something like this. If I say it's 2 o'clock right now, and I've got a picture of a clock that says it's 2 o'clock, and then I pick another picture up and it shows the same clock and it says 4, and I say, how many hours later is it? You could say 2, but I say, no, it was really 14. Oh, no, it was 75 days and 2 hours later. You don't know. So just looking at those two pictures, you can't go back. It's easy for me to go one way, but it's very difficult for you to go back the other way. That's this idea of what are called hard problems in cryptography, and the discrete logarithm is one of the 2 hard problems that we use routinely, and I'll actually look at both of them. The bigger problem here is that this is called an anonymous key agreement. Sarah got 6 from, she thinks Chuck, but how does she know? She can't. She sent a 9, Chuck got that. He thinks he got it from Sarah, but somebody in between, remember, could pick that up, take it, move it, give something else, could alter the traffic in between. So even though they can do this, it's very susceptible to man in the middle. So instead, a year to 2 years later, Reves, Shamer, and Adelman, it's unfortunate, they were 2 of them, or 3 of them. If they'd only been 2, then, right, Diffie-Hellman, we don't call it well, you see it abbreviated DH, but no one ever talks about the DH protocol. But, yeah, that's correct. That's correct, right? But I still think we wouldn't spill it all out, right? Right. So anyway, yes, RSA. That's what the RSA stands for. Is actually the 3 gentlemen's name who came up with this scheme roughly a year or 2 after Diffie-Hellman. I'm going to go through the scheme here. It's much trickier mathematically. I'm just going to go through the scheme and then I'll show why. In this scheme, you choose 2 prime numbers. You want them to be roughly the same size, not too close, not too far apart. You multiply them together and you get, in this case, 55. I chose 5 and 11. I multiply them together and I get 55. And then I calculate this mysterious function called a phi function. It's actually Euler's totient function. Why? Bear with me, but I do. I calculate it by taking one off of both of the primes and multiplying that together, and I get 40. That actually represents the number of integers less than 55 that are co-prime with 55. Again, okay, why? That sounds all wonderful and well, but let's see. Sarah then chooses a number 17. And she finds the D such that that mathematical relationship holds. E times D modded by that 40 is equal to 1. So she solves the equation 17D mod 40 equals 1, and she gets 33. Now, how do you do that? There's an algorithm to do that for you. I mean, you can read through it again. It's based on the math. You can read, but there's an algorithm that does that. And in fact, when you hit OpenSSL and say generate a key pair, it's doing this. Right? Bigger numbers. Right? So Sarah now arbitrarily declares one of the values public and the other value private. They're completely interchangeable. However, as a side note, you tend to make the public one easier to calculate with because it's the guy that's the public one. You think of the server as being the stronger person and the client as being the less likely to have horsepower. So you usually choose the E wisely in that case. Okay. So she's got a public key and a private key. Why did she do this? Again, okay, that's wonky, nice math, but well, who cares? It's because of this stunning result, if you really think about it. This is the reason why we have security on the internet today, because of that result. If I take any value k between 2 and k minus 1, so between 2 and 55, 3 and 55, 54, if I take k and raise it to the eth power, 17 here, and then I raise that to the 33rd power, I get k back. And that little simple equation is the whole idea behind RSA. The other part was just why it worked. This is the why we care. Right? So that means that we tend to say the E, I chose the E in we do in the literature, we call E encryption, and we call D decryption. And this is asymmetric encryption. Now, to differentiate that between asymmetric cryptography, which also includes Diffie-Hellman, this is asymmetric encryption. Okay? So I encrypt by raising to the E. I decrypt by raising to the D. This also, we're going to see an example of this, but this scheme is computationally slow. You don't use this for bulk encryption. You only use this for key exchange. That's why we said earlier, what I said earlier when I said, how are we going to actually secure this traffic? We're going to secure it through a symmetric key. The question is, how do we agree on the symmetric key? This is part of the solution that TLS and HTTPS have come up with for doing that key distribution. We're going to see that next. As an aside quickly, this scheme is, we call it encryption. It's also the way you do digital signatures. You just do it the other way. Use the D you raise to the Dth power and you call that signing. You raise to the E power and you call that verifying. Because these things are really interchangeable. You can take it to the E, then to the D, or to the D and then to E. It doesn't matter. All right, so here's a simplified version of Sarah did all that work. Well, OpenSSL did, but Sarah feels proud of herself, so she posted up and says, I'm great, I've got this key. Chuck says, give me your key, because now they're after trying to come up with a shared key. Chuck says, give me your key, and Sarah sends him her public key. He picks a random 6, just some value. Takes the 6 to the 17, that's her public key, mods it by 55, gets 41, and sends that to Sarah. On her side, she takes the 41, raises it to the 33rd power, mods that by 55, and gets back, voila, his 6. And Chuck it. I'm not going to talk about that nonsense, that's just a verification scheme. Chuck and Sarah established this key in what's called a key transport. Okay? Chuck picked a key and transported it to Sarah without any. I'll do more about that in a moment. So, the structure. Here's what I'm really after. This is the structure of TLS. This is the structure of HTTPS. You have these numbers that have some mathematical relationship, some predefined mathematical relationship that you have to have you have to care about mathematics to understand why that works, but it's there. It is a math relationship that makes this work. Given the En, it's very difficult to determine the D. That's known as the RSA problem. It's actually linked to the integer factorization problem by, because it's linked to the integer factorization problem because given the number n, it's very difficult to know what two prime numbers you multiplied by to get n. It just turns out, I can multiply two numbers together easily, but pulling them back apart turns out to be the second most important, or the second of the two hard problems that we talk about in cryptography. Here, in this case, is the integer factorization problem. And it's the reason RSA works. Or the reason RSA gets us a step towards security. The structure again, though. Chuck trusts that that E and N belonged to Sarah. Right? If you look back at my thing, he just took it and used it. Okay? He either has to do that one of two ways. He either says, it's Sarah, what the hell, right? Or he says, how do I know this is Sarah? Well, it turns out I have a friend named Trent, and Trent knows Sarah. I'll call Trent and say, Trent, does this look like it came from Sarah? And Trent says, yeah, that came from Sarah. So either explicitly trusts it, or he transfers that trust. And that transfer of trust is a multi-billion-dollar industry called PKI. It's the certificate authorities, etc. They're all playing Trent so that Chuck can know who Sarah is. Okay? Sarah trusts, she wants to talk to Chuck. And Duncan mentioned this in his talk earlier, that it may be that you would really like to say, I don't really want to talk to Chuck. I don't need to, but nothing in this protocol that we've looked at here would have stopped that from happening. I'm going to refer to this as an open system. It's a multi-entity trust model in general. Obviously, if you're using self-signed and you're or explicitly, you can say, well, no, I'm not really using that. We'll talk about that a little more. But there's no single control of who talks to whom. But the real aspect of it being open is that, think about where this came from. How did we get here? People were building websites. That was Sarah. Who did they want to come to their website? Every frickin' Chuck in the world. Come on, everybody come in. That's what makes it open, right? This scheme in an open system is remarkable and the best we can do. It's a remarkable scheme. But, there's going to be a but. It is susceptible to man in the middle. Okay? Here's Mallory. This is our think evilly and does evil. Right? She anything Sarah can do, she can do. She does it. She knows OpenSSL. She creates her own keys. Okay? And this time when Chuck says, give me the key, Mallory jumps in there and says, well, no, what I'm going to do is I'll ask Sarah for the key. She'll give me her key back and I'll give my key to Chuck. Okay? And Chuck takes the 6, does what we did before, gets 76 this time, sends it to Mallory, who takes his 76 and finds out, oh, he's sending a 6. So I'll encrypt it and send it to Sarah. She'll use my keys to unpack it and get the 6. Now here's an issue here. They did key agreement by key transport again, but Sarah knows the secret. But it's even worse than that. There's nothing that Chuck and Sarah, the change that made Chuck and Sarah be able to smell that just happened to them. Right? There's nothing about it that they could say, because of that trust of the 2391. The way you would detect this is that you would say, hey, this 2391 didn't come from Sarah. Right? That's the mechanism, that's the transfer of trust or some scheme of PKI that you transfer that trust to somebody else because you say, I can't handle it. This is a document that I think most of you probably heard about, the shadow brokers, and when they dumped these tools that they got from that belonged to the NSA, they were hacking tools for the NSA, some suite of tools. There was also in that a bunch of documents, and one of those documents was a CIA document. It's called the Network Operations Division's Cryptographic Requirements. This is basically their requirements to third-party vendors who are writing security software that the CIA will use. They're saying that's what this document's about. And in it has this this quote, I don't tend to like to have long quotes and stuff, but I'm going to read it and then we're going to parse it. Any transport layer encryption, that's interesting. Come back here. Any transport layer encryption must be layered over the cryptography discussed in this document. What's transport layer encryption? TLS. Right. What's layered over the cryptography discussed in this document? They're discussing in the document ways to do application layer security. Okay? Because the outer layer may be decrypted by an attacker, any encryption must be just for traffic blending only, and the ouch is that last one, not for secrecy. And yet, what are we using HTTPS for day after day after day? Part of it is secrecy, confidentiality in the CIA of Duncan's talk, that confidentiality. Right? They're blatantly saying they don't trust it. They say we are going to use application level security no matter what. I mean, even if you have to do that to play in our sandbox. Okay? So the last scenario is using a framework that I'm building that does this exact thing, does application level security. Application layer security, I see. Here's what a request response looks like when using srpc. The secure, it's based on I'll talk about this in a moment. It's based on something called the Secure Remote Password Protocol, which was developed by Thomas Wu in about 1997. It's actually an option in the TLS suite, but very rarely used because it requires some setup that I'm going to discuss in a moment. But I'm also going to discuss a case where maybe that setup is exactly what we want. But here's what it looks like when you use it. And unlike the TLS situation, well, actually, let's look at a simplified how it works. Again, this one actually looks a little mystical like the RSA did. I'm not going to explain all the reasons why, but here's the key. Chuck and Sarah agree again to use a generator and a prime number. Okay. This time, instead of Sarah, Chuck's choosing. Chuck chooses a 5 and calculates this thing called a verifier, which is just 2 to the 5th mod 13, and that's a 6. Chuck keeps the 5, and gives the Sarah the 6. There's the huge, huge difference. I just did the key distribution problem by saying that Chuck kept the 5 and gave how did he give it to the 6 to Sarah? That's what I want to talk a little more about, but that was the key distribution. I just pulled a sleight of hand and I'm going to brush it over and I'll come back to it. First we're going to see how it works. Chuck picks a random 11, takes 2 to the 11th power mod 13, sends the 7 to Sarah. Notice that this time he has to send an ID because Sarah's got Chuck's 6, but she could have Charles 50, and she could have Emery's 99. She needs to know who's sending this, so he sends it, hey, this is Chuck, and I'm sending this value 7. She picks a random number B, and she computes this value where she takes the 7 that Chuck, boy, my slide's wrong. That says to the 4th, it's not, it should be the 7th. She takes the 6 that Chuck gave her, adds it to 2 to the 7th mod 13 to get 9, and she sends that 9 back to... No, I'm sorry, this is correct. The 4 is the random number, what she's going to do that at the moment. She gets a 9, she sends that back to Chuck. Chuck takes the 9 and calculates this and gets a 3. Sarah takes the 7 she got and calculates this magic and gets a 3. The thing that pops out, the magic here, is that the same value pops out on both sides. Okay? That is another key distribution. Right? This is a key exchange. But there's a very big difference between this key exchange and the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, even if we use the Diffie-Hellman key exchange under the umbrella of RSA, which is typically what you do in TLS. I'm skipping over that. That's a way to verify, to confirm that they've got the same key. Here we'd say again, Chuck and Sarah established the key via key agreement. Earlier I showed key transport with Diffie-Hellman and RSA. You could put Diffie-Hellman into RSA and create key agreement. You don't tend to want one side to be able to determine the key. That's cryptographically a no-no. You want both people to have skin in the game. So here Chuck and Sarah both have skin in the game. They're random numbers. Okay? So look at the structure. I'm showing this again just to show how it's similar to RSA. There's these four values that have a binding relationship, a binding mathematical property. Given three of those, it's very difficult to determine the other one. It turns out that the SRP problem is dependent on the Diffie-Hellman problem, which I said earlier, dependent on the discrete logarithm problem. But it's a same chain of thought that this becomes a hard problem. So it's what we base our security. The difference here is Chuck and Sarah only trust each other, and their key is because that next piece. Each holds a participating piece of the binding, that mathematical binding. This is going to work only in a closed system. Why do I care about that? Well, first of all, let me say what a closed system is. Single entity trust model, explicit control over who talks to whom. This is a situation that I have right here. I wrote the iPad app. I wrote that app. I trust me. I trust me only. I don't need Trent. I don't want Trent. I say I'll make this be the client. So this has the 5 on it. This has, I don't remember what it was, a value, I think it was 6. And they can do this srpc, or this secure remote password protocol handshake and get the pile of bytes that becomes the symmetric key. Some of the advantages of using something like SRP, and I'll talk in a moment, there's other choices, and application level security. You get mutual client and server authentication. Okay? Almost all TSL authentication is really, again, because you think of it as an open system, you're almost always just authenticating the server to the client, not the other way around. Right? Here, if you look back at that scheme, Chuck will only talk to Sarah, and Sarah will only accept something from somebody she knows, Chuck, that she's got a verifier that she can actually do the keys with. Right? So it's mutual. On top of this, I actually have another layer on it that allows me to do mutual user authentication. I differentiate between these two because I think it's actually important. I would have shown this. But the first authentication is between this is a piece of software I wrote, and that's a piece of software I wrote. The second, but remember this, I sold this to somebody. The second is that then the person, Pam, can put her password and username and password into here, and then only she can talk to this. That's the user authentication. That's what keeps Frank from coming over and doing the same thing. So it has actually two pieces. It has the authentication between the two devices, and then it allows to add into that an authentication per given user through that binding mechanism that I was talking about. This authentication, this is just a little, it's just a cool thing when you first see it. This authentication uses what's called a zero knowledge proof. Whenever you log in, whenever you log into a website or whenever you're doing logins, think how often you do this. What does the client send you? Raw password, raw ID over an encrypted pipe called TLS. Right? That means what? That means that the server gets those values. Now, we tend to think, well, we trust that server, right? Well, what if you're my mom? She uses 1Password. I use a program called 1Password. I love it. She uses 1Password, but she uses 1Password. She's 85 years old. That's all she's got. Right? So when she goes to Crate and Barrel, they get the same username and password that she also uses she lives in rural Oklahoma, so she does all her shopping through these things. She uses the same one that's over here and name 50 other catalogs that are online. She uses it over there too. So anybody at Crate and Barrel can buy it over on this other one. And the thing that's really kind of interesting about that is that if that were to happen to her, she would think it was the other site, not Crate and Barrel. She'd get mad at the other guy, right, who didn't do anything, right, other than do the same scheme. Right? It's also possible, people, sometimes you hear people say, my password magically got stolen, I don't know how. If I am a think evil and do evil person, and I work in the back ops of this company, and I'm getting all these things in, I could siphon them off and sell them through a scheme where you do credential stuffing. To a site that they could say, go out to 1,000 of these things and try all of these combos and see which ones work. It's actually an issue that I don't think anybody talks about it, and I don't know why. I think if you use this zero knowledge proof, the idea here is that when Chuck and Sarah did their combo, they sent random numbers across. The password never went across. It never goes across. They're just basically using this idea of zero knowledge proof, is that I can prove to you that I know the password, but I don't tell you the password, and you never know the password. The authentication and the encryption are in the same layer. This is just in case you ever read something about TLS and the proposals to do what's called channel binding, where you're trying to say, I'm encrypting up here, but I'm communicating down here. How do I bind those two channels together? Well, if in application level layer security, you are already at the same channel, so you don't have to think in terms of, right? Another really key one to me is, I've already spoken several times, this is single entity security model, right? I trust myself. I wrote both of these. I don't involve anybody else. The other thing that I think is a nice feature of this, the security is orthogonal to the API. Okay? If I use application layer security, that means that nobody can see my API except the people inside my company. That doesn't mean that you still don't have some vulnerabilities, but at least it keeps me from grabbing a jailbroken device and looking at your API and deciding, hey, I wonder if they covered all these cases if I change this or change that or put that in. You know, I've got lots of stories where I've fussed with that idea. A couple other things I do in srpc. This is what I've talked about so far is really just based on using SRP or something like it and application layer security. Now I'm talking actually my particular version of this. I have the ability to do client initiated key refresh. So you as a developer can say, I've been using this key, at certain intervals, just kick off this request and the keys will be refreshed. There's actually 4 keys being used. 1 key to encrypt one way, 1 key to encrypt the other way, and then 1 key that does a message authentication code in one way and one in the other way. So at any time you can say refresh those keys, and both sides will do some magic on their sides and pop out and have a new sets of keys. That reduces the amount of traffic used by 1 key, which reduces the amount of material for somebody to do cryptanalysis on your stuff. So it's kind of nice. But more importantly, I've even got this to where you can do it manual or auto. You can say, you could set a configuration that says every 100 times you do this, after you use the key 100 times, throw it away and get some new keys. Or you can put time limit on it. You say the keys are only good for an hour, right? After an hour's worth of use, pop, and you don't, all you did was set it. Also have auto connect on first stale. I did this actually in the iOS client because it's not uncommon for somebody to be doing this, turn this off, and then turn it back on, want to use it, but the session timed out, because this guy only keeps the session for so long, right? The session timed out, but they still kind of know each other, so if you want, you can turn this on and this will say, oh, I tried to contact them, but the session timed out, so I'll do a new handshake on your behalf. Okay. This also, again, this is a minor thing, but I do client key stretching on the client. Almost because of the structure of things, you almost always have to be doing the client key stretching on the server. This actually truly allows you to do it on the client. Traffic blending, replay protection. I'm going to move through this because here's the only thing I changed. I only put a new theme in that stack. This thing encrypts or decrypts on the way in, encrypts on the way out. Are there other options? Password authenticated key exchange, yes, there are others. SRP is just one of a number of password. It's an augmented, but there's many others. There's a slew of others. What if I say, well, the problem there was that Chuck had to get the key from Sarah. Why don't I just put the key on Sarah? Put the key into Chuck, Sarah's private or public key into Chuck. You can do that. Station-to-station protocols, slew of other ways to do that as well. But you're outside the realm of TLS, but you can do it. There's also a slew of other things to do. I ended up on slew of other on all of those on purpose. if you get into cryptographic protocols and think about which one you use, you will die of indigestion, not starvation, right? So there's a demo, an Elixir-only demo on both sides. This demo is also available, but it requires that you have an iOS device that's jailbroken. I don't know how many of you would actually have that. So I have a demo instead that is pure Elixir. It's an Elixir client, Elixir server. Okay? Thank you.